Abraham migrated into the Holy Land during the Middle Bronze Age. That would be between the years 2000 and 1500 BC. He migrated from what today we call Iraq through Syria and then made his way down here in the Negev to Beersheba. Beersheba means 7 springs, which is surely what attracted him to this area. He and Sarah were what we call semi-nomads. That means that they would be able to farm because there is rain in the winter here, but in the summer they would need to pick up their tents and go with their flocks where they could find vegetation, until the next fall and winter they return and with the rains replant and harvest their crops. Abraham had a dispute with a local chieftain, Avimelech, over the wells in this area, perhaps the well behind me, which has been reconstructed. But they negotiated and swore to a peace treaty to share the 7 springs. In Hebrew, to swear an oath is the same word for 7. So there's a word play. He came to Beersheba, the place of the 7 springs, and the place of the swearing of an oath with the local inhabitants. Abraham and his family lived in this area of the Negev for 3 generations. He was followed by Isaac and then Jacob. As the book of Genesis ends, because of a famine in this region, Jacob and his 12 sons had to move to Egypt, where the Nile supplied a constant sustenance. When the book of Exodus opens, we find 400 years later the Israelites as slaves in Egypt. We're here in the wilderness of Zin before a natural spring waterfall. The exodus of the Israelites from Egypt occurred in about 1250 BC during the reign of Pharaoh Ramses II. Moses took them to Mount Sinai, which is probably in Saudi Arabia today. There he received the 10 Commandments. They tarried there a while, and then he brought them north through the wilderness of Paran, the wilderness of Zin, where we are now, on his way to the Negev, which is the gateway into the land of milk and honey, the promised land, Canaan. Once they reached Beersheba and Arad, the gateway into Canaan, Moses sent 10 spies to check out the lay of the land. But 8 of them came back fearful that God could not enable them a victory. And for this, the Lord sentenced that generation to wandering in the wilderness. During those 40 years, imagine their joy when they came upon this pool with fresh water and perhaps bathing in the waterfall. In the winter, there's much more water than there is now. After this faithless generation had passed, Moses took their children across the Arava Desert into what is today southern Jordan, and then moving north to Mount Nebo, where he bid them farewell and left it for Joshua to take them into the Holy Land. Jericho is the oldest and lowest city on earth. Situated at the level of the Dead Sea, it is 1,300 feet below sea level. And the human-built tower is from the Stone Age. It's 10,000 years old. Looking about, one can see why the first city would be built here. It's an oasis in the desert due to the springs here at Jericho. Moses brought the children of Israel up the east bank of the Jordan River and ascended Mount Nebo. He preached a sermon recorded in the book of Deuteronomy and descended and died on the other side. Or at least the text at the end of Deuteronomy says, God buried him, God's own self, and no one knows the place. It was left for Moses' successor, Joshua, to bring the people across the Jordan River. You recall when the Ark of the Covenant reached the Jordan River, it stopped flowing and parted, just like the Red Sea had done for Moses. The first Canaanite settlement that the Israelites met was Jericho. So far, the archaeological excavations don't show a massive city wall here at the time. That had been destroyed earlier around the time of Abraham. But there was a temple complex with a small wall, and this is the wall that features in the story of the blowing of the shofars, that is the ram's horns. And Joshua and the Israelites took this first city very easily. From then, it was moving throughout the Judean and Samaritan hill country, where they quickly began to settle. It was about 1200 BC when Joshua brought the children of Israel into the Promised Land. But there was not immediately a nation of Israel. For 200 years, there was a tribal confederacy, sometimes called the period of the Judges. Then, about the year 1000, King David arose to unite those 12 tribes into a single nation. He purchased the threshing floor of Aravna, which is now beneath the Golden Dome behind me. Then his son Solomon built the temple on that same spot. En Gedi means spring of the mountain goat. And if you visit here, you'll see the ibex, or the local mountain goats, treading everywhere along these slopes. En-Gedi is mentioned 3 times in the Bible. The most famous story is this is where David fled from King Saul. You recall that King Saul had been David's mentor. He had comforted him with his music. Saul was training him alongside his son Jonathan. But David became so popular that Saul was jealous and sought to kill him. Wisely, David fled out here to the Judean wilderness by the spring of En-Gedi, where fresh water was abundant. Caves were readily available for sleeping and for shelter from the sun. At one point, King Saul was right on his trail here at En-Gedi, where David was relatively comfortably living among these caves with abundant fresh water supply. But Saul had to go up for a moment of relieving himself. And you know, Jewish men, according to Torah, must wear fringes on their garments. And David snuck up behind him when he was most vulnerable, cut off the fringe of his garment, and later showed his former mentor that he could have killed him had he wanted, but did not. The second mention of En-Gedi in the Bible is in the Song of Solomon, where the groom says to his bride, "Your hair smells sweeter than the henna blossoms of En-Gedi." And finally, En-Gedi is mentioned at the end of the scroll of Ezekiel, speaking about the Messianic age, when water will flow from a purified temple in Jerusalem through the Kidron Valley all the way to the Dead Sea and freshen it, so that people will catch as many types of fish in the Dead Sea as today they catch in the Mediterranean Sea. A parallel fortress in the Negev to Beersheba is Arad. Already Moses and the Israelites had met the king of Arad as they passed from Egypt toward the Holy Land. Many years later, King David built a fortress here, and his son Solomon added a temple for the soldiers that would be stationed at Arad. I am standing in the courtyard of that temple, and behind me is the altar where the worship would take place. Only the priests would enter into the temple building to my right. In the middle of this long temple building is the Holy of Holies. Entrance into it is by 2 incense altars. And against the far wall, we found 2 standing stones, looking suspiciously like the 2 tablets of the law upon which God wrote the 10 Commandments for Moses. Perhaps the greatest significance that this Temple of Solomon here at Arad holds for us is that it gives us just a glimpse of what his much larger and grander temple in Jerusalem was like. While the temple in Jerusalem was narrow and deep, and this one is broad and shallow, nonetheless, it brings us into the worship life of ancient Israel. This temple helps us understand how the Israelites worshiped during Solomon's reign and afterwards. I'm here on the Mount of Olives with Professor Mustafa Abu Sway of El Quds University. Good morning, Mustafa.
Good morning.
Mustafa, as a Muslim, what special ties do you feel to the Holy Land?
Well, the Holy Land is, of course, mentioned in the Quran using properly these words, the Holy Land, Al-Ard al-Muqaddasa. It is mentioned so many times in the Quran as a blessed land, but once as a holy land. And it's in the story of Prophet Moses, peace upon him, with the children of Israel. So this is also a link with the previous phases of revelation. Islam simply is the last phase of revelation. This is where, from an Islamic perspective, the whole history of revelation ends, and the Holy Land is holy, and one needs not to conflate holiness with geopolitics. So holiness does not stop at walls and borders and fences and what have you. Most people might conflate the Holy Land with the geopolitical map of today, which is not the case. We feel that this is really the one of the three most important places. There is another fourth one. When we talk about three places, we talk about the Holy Land, including Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. We talk about Medina and Mecca. And also in the story of Prophet Moses, the Holy Valley. This is the burning bush story. In the Quran, it is mentioned that it took place in the Holy Valley. We don't know where the Holy Valley is. So we are left with these three holy places.
Well, you grew up just on the western slope of the Mount of Olives, right behind you.
It is true.
What's it like growing up on the Mount of Olives?
First of all, you have immediate access to all the holy places and the historical places. In fact, I learned swimming in the Gihon spring. I mean, we used to go through the tunnel as kids. Kids did literally dig ancient coins really from the mountain. But it's more of exploring the old city as a child. And I have a special feeling, like, I mean, it intimately. The alleys. I can in my imagination go through Lions Gate or go through Damascus Gate or go through Jaffa Gate, and I know where I am heading. It's always beautiful when I go in the morning. Sometimes I go through Lions Gate to go, for example, to Al-Aqsa Mosque, and I see priests and nuns going to the Gethsemane. So you meet basically, it's a place where the different three monotheistic religions meet, despite the political nature of what's going on the religious level. All three basically meet in this beautiful city. And from an Islamic perspective, we have been part of the mosaic of this land for 1400 years, and I would say it's a beautiful story.
You're describing the gates of the Old City.
Yes.
And the Old City walls built by Suleiman the Magnificent.
Yes.
In the 16th century.
Yes.
So hearing you talk about it, I sense you have a special affinity with Jerusalem.
Of course, when I look at the city, I've looked at the city years and decades, one decade after the other, and the city never fails to mesmerize me, especially in the evening. Sometimes I pray at a mosque on the slopes of Mount of Olives, facing the old city and Al-Aqsa Mosque. It seems that sometimes you need a little bit of a distance to see beauty, but of course, going to Al-Aqsa Mosque is very, very special. Sometimes you talk about the most beautiful aesthetically, the Dome of the Rock on the inside, on the outside. Basically, this is a place that was built by the Umayyads 1400 years ago, and it's still standing. It's still welcoming. Sometimes in Arabic poetry, Palestinian poetry, they talk about this dome reflecting basically the will of heavens. There are certain beautiful elements that it nourishes the soul. I do teach at Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is also a very special, I feel very, very special to be able to do this. I teach Imam al-Ghazali, our medieval Muslim scholar who died in the year 1111, and it's all about spirituality, so all about nurturing the heart.
As a Muslim, tell me, what do you think is the most important thing Islam has to teach the world?
I believe Islam is there to stress the original message that came through revelation, which is the oneness of God and love of thy neighbor. This is really the Islam, and the details are many. Taking care of your neighbor, taking care of your, not only the Muslim but also the non-Muslim. I can tell you through a family story that could express this beautiful relationship with the neighbor. My mother breastfed our Christian neighbor, and in Islamic law called Sharia, she became literally my sister. I'm her brother. We cannot marry each other. This is one of the most beautiful things, one of the most beautiful stories in my life.
So you have a Christian sister?
I have a Christian sister, not through blood relationship, but through milk one. I mean, it's something that I cherish as a part of the history of the family, and it's not the only family that has such a beautiful relationship with neighbors. So Islam is there to stress the oneness of God, but also the oneness of humanity, and you try the best to heal that which was basically the wounds of humanity, and they are many.
A lot of Americans have the impression that Islam is a religion of violence. What would you say to them?
First of all, I don't blame them for having this, impression, because the media keeps showing only that which is violent, which is a very tiny minority who are not representative of Islam. And as much as just think about Jews or Christians, you have a tiny minority who does basically the odd, the ugly, the violent, the extremist, and that does not represent basically any particular faith. So I don't blame them, but at the same time I invite them to look at the almost 2 billion people who do not engage in acts of violence. And the nature of the religion itself is a religion that advocates peace and advocates cordial relationship with neighbors, especially with the people of the book, with Christians and Muslims.
Well, thank you, Mustafa, for
Pleasure.
giving us a few minutes this morning out of your busy schedule.
Thank you for the opportunity.
We've been with Professor Mustafa Abu Sway of El Quds University, a resident who lives right here on the Mount of Olives, overlooking the Golden Dome of the Rock. Gazing at the entire Holy Land from atop Tel Gezer, what an exhilarating experience. Here we have found the most ancient Hebrew document so far discovered, the Gezer calendar. According to the Book of Kings, Solomon fortified 3 cities, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Gezer means cutting edge, and it is on the cutting edge of the entire country, with the seacoast behind me and the mountains in front of me. From here we can view all the land of milk and honey. What does that term mean, the land of milk and honey? It's not a general term for fruitfulness. It is a specific technical term. The land of milk means a land where you can get milk from your flocks, your sheep and your goats. So it is a land of grazing. The land of honey. Biblical Israel did not know the cultivation of bees. The only mention of bee honey in the Bible is wild bee honey. The word is davash, and it means date honey. So a land of date honey is a land that can support agriculture and farming. Round about the Holy Land are nations mostly barren, maybe only grazing, or along the Nile only farming. But this is a land that supports both farming and grazing, a land of honey and milk, or as the Bible says, Eretz Chalav Udavash, a land flowing with milk and honey. This land of milk and honey has 5 deserts, 4 seas, and 3 regions. We are standing in Judea, or Judah, in the Old Testament period. Just to my left is Samaria, Shomron in Hebrew. And further to the north is Galilee. Judea, Samaria, in Galilee. 3 regions. It's a land of 2 peoples today, Jews and Arabs. And the Arabs are themselves either Christians or Muslims. And it is a land of one God. All of the 3 great monotheistic religions abide here: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all worshiping the God of Abraham, all brothers and sisters learning to remember how we all used to live together. The land of milk and honey does have more specific geographical areas. The seacoast is divided into 2 coastal plains. Basically, south of the airport where you fly in is the Philistine Plain, and north of Tel Aviv is the Sharon Plain. Running up and down the spine of the country is the Samaritan Hill Country to the north and the Judean Hill Country to the south. In between the coastal plain and the Samaritan and Judean Hill Countries is the Shephelah, the rolling hills that support verdant agriculture. And farthest to the north is Galilee, first sloping mountains rising all the way to a peak at Mount Hermon, 9,000 feet above sea level. So you see, in the Holy Land we have every feature of geography that we have in America, just compressed into a smaller space, let's say about the size of New Jersey. When you come here, you will travel throughout and you'll be amazed how quickly the geography changes and how much you will see in just 10 days.